You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello and welcome to Switched On Australia, the podcast about the people, the ideas and technologies shaping our clean energy future. I'm Anne Delaney. Thanks for joining me. More than 500,000 Australian households get their electricity through what's known as an embedded network. These are private electricity systems where power is bought through a single gate meter and then resold to residents behind it. They're common in large apartment buildings, retirement villages and even caravan parks. And on paper, they promise a lot. Cheaper energy, smarter use of solar and batteries, and a simpler path to electrify whole buildings. But for many residents in embedded networks, the reality has been very different. Some find they can't choose their own electricity retailer, and they end up paying more than they would on the open market. Others miss out on the renewable energy savings they were promised by the developer or operator. Despite these problems, reform has been painfully slow, and that's worrying because as new housing grows, especially apartments, the number of embedded networks is expanding. This week, the New South Wales Government did announce plans to cap the prices that embedded network operators can charge tenants. And in Victoria, new embedded networks with 10 or more residential customers have been banned since early 2023, unless they meet renewable energy conditions. But what will it take to make embedded networks genuinely work for consumers and the energy transition? It turns out the answer often comes down to who controls the embedded network. The most successful examples are, perhaps unsurprisingly, those led by communities themselves, not companies chasing profits. Connor James is the director and principal of the law firm Law Quarter and principal of Compliance Quarter, which advises both the energy sector and consumers on renewable energy and distributed energy resources. I began by asking Connor to explain how an embedded network actually works.
An embedded network is a distinct approach to electricity supply, and it's formed when you have what's called a gate meter, so a single meter that's facing the market, and individual customers sit behind that gate meter. They're supplied via child meters, and effectively what you have is a privately owned or managed electricity embedded network that sits outside of, although connected to, the wider electricity distribution system.
And they're commonly used in large apartment blocks and what else?
Sure. So large apartment blocks, you find them in caravan parks. You're finding them more and more in shopping centres and industrial complexes. So basically anywhere where you've got a number of tenants typically co-located within a single building or a single site, and you've got some coordination that leads to the establishment of that embedded network and its ongoing management.
Mm-hmm. And so why are, say, developers and property owners increasingly turning to embedded networks?
So there's a number of reasons. At the stage when they're developing a property, there is an incentive for them to obviously reduce costs, and embedded networks provide that option. Typically what you'll have is an embedded network operator, a commercial entity that will come in and install solar, install battery, install electric vehicle charging stations. Those are costs that would otherwise be met by the developer. And then that embedded network operator will then run the embedded network, will sell the energy to the tenants within that embedded network on an ongoing basis. For the developer, it's about those avoided costs. It's about meeting sustainability targets, the marketability of the property, but also it's a profit profit-driven business, of course. So there are commercial incentives for developers in avoiding those costs and entering into those types of contracts.
So it saves costs for developers, but there is an issue, isn't there, that it's not necessarily saving money for the tenants, for the actual consumers of the power.
That's correct. The problem with a number of embedded networks has been that tenants within that embedded network find it difficult or impossible to select an alternative energy supplier. And that's because of the metering configuration. It's because it's harder for your on-market electricity retailer to get access and to supply those customers. And as a result, your tenants are really left with the embedded network operator as their only choice and the pricing that that embedded network operator offers. There's certainly been regulatory reform that's been aimed at either capping the price that can be charged or at helping those tenants opt out and get supply directly from a third-party electricity retailer. But unfortunately, a number of tenants within those embedded networks are not receiving the price that they should be receiving, and in some instances are paying more than what they would be if they were directly connected.
So essentially, in those cases, the embedded network operator isn't passing on the savings that it would be making, especially if it's actually installed solar and storage in an apartment block, for instance.
That's right. So the embedded network operator will achieve potential savings that they can pass on to the tenant, both by aggregating the electricity consumption of the individual tenants and by entering into a bulk purchase arrangement at the gate meter, also by avoiding network costs. So if you think about individual tenants that would be connected, they're all paying for use of the distribution network, whereas within an embedded network, it's effectively seen as a single customer from the perspective of the market, the distribution network, and therefore it's paying a single set of distribution costs at that gate meter. And as you mentioned, the electricity that is consumed is a blend of electricity that's sourced from the gate meter, but also electricity that's generated on site using renewable sources. So theoretically, when you bundle all of that up together, there should be a saving that can be passed on to consumers, and that saving is a direct result of the integration of renewable technology. But unfortunately, that hasn't always been the case, and there continue to be customers within embedded networks who aren't realizing those savings.
And you mentioned that there has been some regulatory reform. Why are we not forcing those embedded network operators to pass on those savings?
It's been an area that's been looked at quite extensively since 2017. We had a review that was conducted by the Australian Energy Market Commission that put forward a whole suite of law and rule changes. Unfortunately, those weren't adopted. We've had various reviews in specific states, such as in Victoria, and we've also recently had the Australian Energy Regulator that looks after the national framework publish its revised regulatory framework within the new guidelines. They don't specifically limit the price that can be charged to individual occupants. And part of the problem is just the complexity of the regulatory framework. You've got the state framework, you've got a national framework that's not necessarily harmonized. And then we have mechanisms such as the default market offer. The default market offer operates as a cap for most embedded networks in terms of what can be charged, but not for all. And currently, the Commonwealth Energy Department is looking at the default market offer and also some of those gaps, and looking at how we can ensure that those reduced bills go through to tenants within embedded networks.
As you said, the AEMC, the Australian Energy Market Commission, proposed reforms way back in 2017. And as you said, they were not adopted. I can only assume that they were not adopted because of the power of property developers. Is that a correct assumption?
It certainly was, at least in part, a result of lobbying. I mean, it was an interesting situation because there was agreement between a number of consumer advocates, but also what I'll call industry, that's the commercial operators, that those reforms were needed. We went through this whole reform review. The final report was published, and then nothing was heard. We ended up putting in a Freedom of Information request to the South Australian Energy Department. And, as I'm sure you would know, when you get responses to those types of requests, most of the documents are redacted.
Yes, I was going to say.
So, reading between the lines, there certainly was some lobbying. It wasn't from developers. However, it was from other, smaller industry associations. And
The embedded network operators?
No, it was so it was mainly your much smaller operators, and in particular your sort of marinas and other operators that were concerned about the cost of compliance with that new framework. So their motivations definitely weren't to stop the consumer protections coming in place to make sure that the regulatory framework was made whole. It was more about the fact that if those changes were implemented, then the cost to run embedded networks would significantly increase. And then ultimately, the ministers at the time, that was COAG, what was known as COAG, the council, each of the individual states, I believe, voted to not implement the changes that were recommended by the AMC.
Yeah, right. Interesting, because we still don't have proper consumer protection for people in embedded networks. Is that a fair enough assumption?
I would say that the regulatory framework has evolved, and the position of consumers as a whole is better than what it was. We've seen changes at the state level, including to the strata legislation in New South Wales recently that limits the term of the agreement between the developer or the body corporate rather, and the embedded network operator. And the idea behind that is to ensure that there's renegotiation, that the pricing and the service can be reviewed on an ongoing basis. We've also seen a whole bunch of new conditions that were introduced by the Australian Energy Regulator. And the consumer research still says that there are significant and real issues that need to be addressed, but at the same time that there are consumers that are paying less than what they would if they were directly connected to the distribution network, and in some instances significantly less than what they would be.
And I think that's what the regulator, they found. They only recently published a review of embedded networks, I understand, I think back in August. And what it found was just huge variability in outcomes. They're a mixed beast, I suppose, is what the regulator was saying.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But I would say that the overall tone has been from back in 2017 or earlier from these are universally a really big problem to one where there's recognition by the AER of the potential benefits of embedded networks, but also of the harms that have resulted and can result from their operation.
Let's talk about some of those potential benefits, because as we know, apartments are often regarded as difficult for individual households to get distributed energy resources like solar and storage. But there are some advantages of having shared property, isn't there? And that's what a lot of these strata title buildings have. They have shared property. Tell me how that can assist with getting distributed, potentially. Let's, blue skies. Paint a picture of what the potential is.
Sure. So I guess the ideal ideal world is one where you have apartment buildings, and we're seeing more and more apartment buildings, of course, apartment buildings where tenants within those apartment buildings get access to lower cost renewable energy. It's as simple as that. And as you say, the potential of embedded networks is that the operator might be run by the community, it might be run by a third party, can install a solar system on the roof, can install a battery, can install electric vehicle charging stations. And it's only through that coordination and centralization within the individual apartment block that that's possible. If you kind of expand that to a wider scale, we could have a situation where there are apartment buildings that are as self-sufficient as possible, and potentially apartment buildings that offer services in terms of export of energy or import of energy to the wider distribution network.
That's where we really want to be going, but there are a number of issues, I suppose, with retrofitting apartments with some of these resources like solar and storage. Just outline some of them, particularly in older buildings.
Yeah. So retrofitting, there are a number of issues that need to be overcome. A lot of the buildings are not necessarily structurally sound to install solar panels, so that's an issue that would be familiar to everybody that works in the industry. You need some engineering expertise to make sure that the systems can be installed correctly and in a safe and reliable manner. Then you've also got and most importantly, of course, you've got the individual tenants. And then there's the question of coordination and translating the complexity of the potential benefits of embedded networks to all of those tenants. Under the AER guideline, the requirement is that you have the explicit informed consent of at least 85% of the tenants. And that means making proper disclosures, engaging with those tenants. And because of the complexity of the energy market and all energy offers that are available, that's no easy feat.
No.
And that's part of the challenge for retrofitting.
Yes. So on the one hand, we've got this blue skies potential being held out, but the reality is that there are a lot of hurdles to overcome in order to retrofit some of these distributed energy resources that we are really going to need in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got a lot of new apartments that are going to be built. I was reading the announcements yesterday. So you both have the need to ensure that we can integrate renewable resources within those new apartments, but we also have a lot of existing apartments and a lot of roof space and commercial and industrial properties. It is difficult, but we're certainly seeing that it is being done. So there are retrofits that are occurring. And it seems as though part of the difficulty there, once again, is having the expertise to know how to go through that whole process and communicate it through to tenants.
We'll talk about some of those positive examples that are now operating. But just before we do, are there any legal obstacles to actually embedding distributed energy resources into strata settings, into these embedded networks?
There certainly are. Amongst those, there are, we're talking about long-term contracts, and it comes down to, well, who's going to pay for this infrastructure in the first place? The analogy or the similar type of contract that listeners would be familiar with is the power purchase agreement. And so it's similar to a power purchase agreement, but with individual customers that are often small, unsophisticated customers. And then you have the issues from the legal perspective of whether those solar panels are fixtures, and what happens to the solar panels at the end of the term of that agreement. It's often the case that commercial operators will either take the solar panels, which presents its own risks and challenges, or that they'll transfer ownership of the panels to the body corporate or the owner of the property, and that requires payment of obviously a certain amount of money. So a whole bunch of legal risks and considerations in these longer term contracts that are quite complex, and where you're trying to sort of look forward into the future about, okay, well, what can happen 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah, so lots to consider for any apartment block that wants to put these resources in. Now, look, there are examples where embedded networks have delivered for consumers, where they've received lower energy bills, better renewable access. Can you talk about some of the positive examples just to show what is possible? And then
Sure.
we'll talk about what they have in common.
So, one of the really positive examples is an embedded network that's actually quite close to where I live, which is the Narara Eco Village. So that's a citizen-run embedded network.
Whereabouts is that? Is that on the Central Coast,
That's
in
on
New
the
South
Central
Wales?
Coast. Yeah, that's right. So Narara. And in that embedded network, they have quite a large battery. They've got some solar there as well. And so they're able to realize the benefit by purchasing the electricity at the gate meter from another retailer, and then combining it with the on-site renewable to offer lower cost energy to the consumers. There are a number of similar embedded networks in the commercial space. And really it comes down to, that contract and what type of guarantees the operator can provide to the tenants that are within the embedded network. And it's about, alignment of incentives, I suppose, who stands to gain and what expertise is required to make sure that the benefits are realized within the embedded network.
But also, I suppose, who's leading the project? Because my understanding is that the Narara Eco Village, for one, is what's called what people are defining as a citizen-led embedded network. So is that key to getting it right for consumers, ensuring that the community is actually leading it to ensure that they get what they need?
It certainly is one of the key elements of success, I'd say, for the Narara Eco Village. It presents its own, whole range of interesting challenges, let's call it that, in terms of governance and how the embedded network is run, how it's established. But clearly, if the embedded network either directly involves the tenants in making some of those decisions, or is run by the tenants, then there's no misalignment of incentives, and maximum benefit can be realized by the tenants. The only counter to that, and the biggest challenge, is of course the expertise side of
Yes.
running the embedded network. And that's why I would say that we see most embedded networks run by third-party specialists. But those third-party specialists and some of the commercial operators do a good job in communicating with tenants and actually attending site and talking to them. And there's more of a capacity for them to do that than your on-market retailer, as an example.
And are they more likely to be employed by the tenants? Those third parties in those citizen-run or citizen-led examples?
They certainly can be. So the citizen-run model, it's either that the citizens are, or the occupants are, engaging specialist third parties to come in and simply provide a service, or alternatively, it might be that you have, in legal terms, what's called a principal agency relationship, where the principal is the tenant body or the citizen body, but the agent is the specialist energy company that can fulfill the role of looking after the internal infrastructure, making sure that that's compliant, and also sending out bills and looking after the typical energy retail side of operations.
And they would have all the necessary, I suppose, electrical engineering experience.
That's right.
Mm. I mean, I'm presuming that the citizen-run embedded networks are rare in Australia because it doesn't sound easy.
No,
It doesn't actually sound easy to set these things up.
no, that's right. From my understanding, using Narara as an example, I think that they've been quite lucky because they've had owners in that site or tenants that actually have expertise, including electrical engineering expertise. But not every community is going to have that internal expertise. So we're talking about electrical engineering expertise. There's also often the need for expertise in the area of regulatory compliance, unfortunately, because the regulatory framework, as we've spoken about, is getting more and more complex. And for most citizen-run organizations, that involves quite a lot of work and does require that expertise. And then the final one, as we've spoken about, is just the overall governance, having the governance structures, making sure that decisions that are made are equitable. And within every community, within every apartment building, you're going to have different views. So governance is really essential, a mechanism for making sure that individuals are heard, that everybody understands what is sought to be achieved, and that they're involved in the process and the outcome.
Well, I was wondering, what do some of the electricity network operators, the poles and wires companies, think about, particularly these citizen-led examples of embedded networks, but perhaps just generally, because they wouldn't be getting as much revenue, would they? Because there wouldn't be the daily charges, the network charges. It's only to a single meter that they, parent meter, I suppose, that they have.
That's correct. So the distributors, in some, we have a whole bunch of different distributors. We've got 3 in New South Wales, but we have got others elsewhere. In some instances, the distributors do see it as a problem, and we've seen that in submissions to the Australian Energy Regulator. Their concerns focus around the lack of revenue or lack of network charges that are recovered. They argue that that can result in an inequitable outcome for the consumers that are outside of the embedded networks, and that that argument does have merit. I mean, there's a broader question about collection of network charges and who pays what, and that's just a key theme of the energy transition. That's something that does need to be considered. The distribution network service providers are also often concerned about whether those networks are safe and reliable in particular. And looking again to this sort of future state of what would be ideal, the distribution network service providers have a lot of expertise, obviously, when it comes to electrical safety and reliable supply. So I would say that, in an ideal world, they would have a role in overseeing electrical safety and compliance. But then we would also not want to lose the advantages, particularly in terms of the capacity to install renewable resources and to ensure that tenants can benefit from that.
Yeah. What additional reforms or changes would you like to see to help more of these citizen-led examples of embedded networks which use distributed energy resources?
I'd say that there's a whole whole range of it, a whole menu of items that I'd like to go through. I think
Name your top 3
not
for
top
me.
3 for the sake of timing. I think that if the regulatory framework and the industry and government can look at the challenges that are faced by citizen-run embedded networks and really focus on addressing those challenges, that would go a long way. To give you an example, the Australian Energy Regulator has done quite a lot of work in providing templates. So looking at the compliance side first of all. Okay, so they'll say for your tenants within your embedded network, you need to have a hardship policy, which is a policy that is designed to ensure that there are protections for customers who are experiencing financial hardship. The AER has done a lot of work in providing template documents, and I can imagine that for citizen-run embedded networks, those type of templates and resources would go a long way. They don't have the same internal resources. They don't have the capital to spend on compliance expertise. That would certainly be one area. On pricing within citizen-run embedded networks is presumably less of an issue because there's no misalignment of incentives. And so it might be the case that that the regulator needs to ensure that there are easier pathways for citizen-run embedded networks to be established and to operate than there currently are.
Yeah.
But having said that, I'd say that the AER has done a lot of work in that area, and there is quite a bit of flexibility in the regulatory framework, but it is also a very complex regulatory framework.
Just a couple of final questions. For everyday consumers, especially those renting in apartments, what's the one question you think they should ask if they actually find themselves in an embedded network?
If they find themselves in an embedded network after the fact, well, I would hope that they would know about it beforehand, and that's one of the areas of regulatory
They don't
reform.
always, do they?
They don't, unfortunately, they don't.
Mm.
I mean, they should look at the service provider. They should certainly look at the pricing, of course, and that's a major and legitimate concern. Ultimately, there are a whole bunch of different resources now available for embedded network consumers. They can review pricing against what are termed generally available offers or offers that can be taken up by consumers that are directly connected. And if the service isn't good enough, if the pricing is wrong, then they should certainly, raise that complaint. They can raise the complaint with the Energy Ombudsman Scheme. That's another change that's occurred over the last 3 years, is that more of the state energy ombudsman schemes are accepting complaints from embedded network consumers. And in an ideal world, although that's obviously not always possible, the tenants and the occupants should have a look at the contract that applies to that embedded network. And if they're not getting a good deal, look at alternatives and alternative operators.
And kind of finally, just for those community groups, the strata bodies or apartment residents who are interested in getting some distributed energy resources, putting the solar on, getting a battery, putting an EV charger in, and they are in an embedded network, where should they start?
So if they're in an embedded network, if it's an embedded network that they're running themselves, then there's a whole bunch of resources, obviously, from solar retailers and from the industry associations about the potential benefits of distributed energy resources. And so I'd say certainly look at that. In terms of what their rights are, the Australian Energy Regulator and in Victoria, the Essential Services Commission and the other state equivalents have quite a lot of information and resources that they can go through. And so it's a matter, I'd say, of, working out, okay, well, what are our rights, but also what's possible and, what can the integration of solar, battery and electric vehicles achieve for the embedded networks. And within an embedded network, renewables make a lot of sense because you've got that blended rate. You've got a whole bunch of customers. They're all consuming energy at different times of the day. So it's an ideal situation to install solar and other renewable technologies.
Is there a risk that embedded networks will become private monopolies that just entrench inequity? Or do you think that they really can become a stepping stone to a much more flexible, decentralized energy system?
I see them as an integral part of a distributed energy network that's has much higher penetration of renewables. The capacity for citizens to work together or for specialist third parties to come in and install solar, install EV chargers, install batteries within embedded networks. And as I've said, the ability potentially for them to work together to provide services to the grid. I think that there's huge potential there. And that's why it's a real challenge, because the regulators and industry are looking at all of these issues that consumers have had within embedded networks. But we also recognize that they are a key part of the transition, and particularly in the context where we've got more and more apartment blocks that are being built, higher density housing, and the need for more housing.
Connor James, thank you so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And Connor James is the Director and Principal of Law Quarter and Principal of Compliance Quarter. That's all for Switched On Australia. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like, share or leave a comment on your favourite podcast platform. I'm Anne Delaney. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join me next time.